Welcome to the Future Series. I'm your host, Anthony Dan, and for those of you that are new to the podcast, we talk with real founders about building a business for the future. Whether you're scaling your business currently or starting your first side hustle, we'll give you the nuggets of information to help you succeed in the future of work. So today we've got Daniel Sawko on the podcast, co-founder and CEO of ShipShape VC. Daniel, how's it going?
Yeah, really good, thank you. And thank you very much for having me. And delighted to be here and share some of the stories that brought us to where we are today.
Yeah, absolutely. No, well, thanks so much for coming on. It's going to be fun delving into these different areas and hearing a bit more about ShipShape. But for listeners that haven't heard of ShipShape, would you be able to just give us a quick overview of what it is that you guys do?
Of course, yes. So ShipShape.vc is a free-to-use investment search engine. So it's enabling founders and those who are raising capital for companies to identify exactly which investors they should be speaking with. Because very often those who are building innovative companies that are solving the really big problems, both of today and of tomorrow, they're building in a niche, and many investors won't understand that niche. And a bit like if you had a particularly fancy boat, the market for whatever that boat is doing is going to be limited. And it's no different when you're selling equity in your company and raising capital for it. Actually, the investors out there that will really understand your company, that's not every investor. And so what we want founders to have to do is know which market they're pitching to as quickly as possible and actually provide them with that information for free.
Amazing. That sounds great. And you've raised over, was it 1.5 billion so far for companies?
Yes, it's actually 2.1 billion. 2.1 billion pounds sterling. That was basically validated by a fund called Future Power Capital, where they compared like the companies that have used us and then how much they've gone on to raise since, which was, a really encouraging number, really, for why we're doing what we're doing. We've actually also used it ourselves to raise for the company too, which, again, like eating your own dog food is definitely the best thing that you can do as a founder.
Amazing. Well, we'll definitely dive into that as well as all these companies you've been helping. But it'd be great to look back to your sort of early career and what you did that built up to starting ShipShape. So where did it all start before ShipShape?
So I spent some time in management consulting. It was mostly sort of advising on big digital transformation changes. This is back in the sort of like mid to late 2010s. And as interesting as some of these projects were, things never moved as quickly as you wanted them to. You're always at the behest of much larger organizations that fundamentally were moving slowly. So even if you're implementing some cool tech, actually the implementation for that might take years. And I guess I'm naturally impatient for wanting things to improve. I ended up going to work for one of the fintech companies that the consultancy I was working for was partnered with. And they were solving, again, it was a niche problem, but it was a big problem for lots of financial institutions globally. And so day two, after sort of arriving, feet sort of not yet properly under the desk, the founder said, "Oh, Daniel, you're good at research. Can you go find which investors we should speak with for our Series A?" And as a sort of naive 20-something-year-old, I thought, "Oh, how hard can this be? Let's do it. There's this wonderful thing called the internet, and the answers will surely be there." And they definitely are there. The problem is that even with LLMs today, they don't do a great job of actually finding the needle in the haystack in many instances. They'll do a reasonable job of giving you a handful of results. But if you're looking to find the market for a piece of equity in your company, you want relevant buyers and as many of them as possible. You don't just want a handful, because ultimately you're going to get the best price for your equity the more competition that there is. And so, basically having tried loads of paid for platforms, often like begging, borrowing access to someone else's license to a platform just to try and find which investors there were out there for the niche that this fintech was building in, realized that actually this is a completely broken market. You've got founders who don't have 10, 20 grand to throw away on a tool, who aren't being served by that. And so that's why we started ShipShape. And sort of the career that led up to it was, and actually I studied economics at university, along with international relations, and the economics bit in particular made me very cognizant of the fact that when markets don't function properly, you end up with really bad externalities or negative side effects. So in this case, what you have in this market, or what you had in this market, is you've got some of the brightest people on the planet being held back from finding the money that they need to solve the problems that they're solving because of these systems that basically are obscuring information rather than revealing it, and hiding it behind a very expensive paywall that many brilliant minds don't have access to the capital to climb over. So that's one of the real driving forces behind what we're doing at ShipShape.
Amazing. It sounds great as well, that whole story around having to find these investors for your Series A. Did you manage to find the right investors in the end, or how did that work?
Yeah, we did. We did. So some were very much aligned with the problem we're solving. And once they were in, it became easier to basically pull in other more generalist investors because they took comfort from the fact that there were some specialists involved who understood the space. And yeah, it took some time. Like, it was definitely a longer process than any of us had anticipated. It was just over a year, start to finish, for a 5 million Series A. But we also managed to bring in US investors to the cap table, which again was really important because the future of the business really lay in the US. So yeah, but it was a great way to see the problem. And we also saw some other problems as well around investors that don't understand the business that you're in are not going to value your company properly either, because if they don't understand the market, and they probably know that they don't understand the market, then they're going to basically say, well, actually, there's an element of risk here. And the way that we're going to price that risk, even if they really like the company, the way that they're going to price that risk for basically them potentially overvaluing it or underestimating the risks associated, is they'll give you basically a discount on your valuation. And so there's a big detrimental side to getting a generalist to set the price for a round where someone doesn't actually understand what it is that your company is doing.
Yeah. For listeners that maybe aren't that well versed in how funding is set up within a Series A, etc., would you be able just to explain quickly how that works in terms of like a lead investor and how everyone follows?
Yes, with rounds, usually you'll have at least one lead investor. Sometimes you have two. I've seen instances where there are more than two lead investors as well. But what a lead investor does is they set the terms for the negotiation. They also carry out the due diligence into the company. And what that means is they really are, if you treat it as someone who's like a mechanic who is doing an MOT on your car, they're the ones who are lifting up the bonnet, or if you're in the US, the hood, and seeing how essentially, how the sausage is made, to mix metaphors here. They're looking at how the engine's running. They're looking at all the parts. They're coming to a valuation. Now, once a lead has sort of got comfortable with the machine that they're buying a part of, other investors who are following on in that round or co-funding a round without being lead investors, they'll basically look at the diligence report, for example, or like the notes that the lead investor has produced from their checking of the engine. That then means that they'll then follow on, and if they're comfortable with what the lead investor has found and at the price usually that the lead investor has set.
Amazing. And that's obviously why it's so important having specialists that understand your industry, but maybe not just for this first round, but subsequent rounds in the future.
Yes, exactly. Really good point, because ultimately, if I were to go out today and to be looking, and to again use the car analogy, if I were to go out today and be looking to buy a petrol car, I know that I would not be the best person to diligence that car. I would ask my dad. My dad knows everything about petrol cars, and I would ask him to basically do the check on whether or not it's is it a good car or is it potentially a lemon? And that's it's no different here. The more knowledgeable someone is who affirms that it's a good thing, the more comfort others will take from it. Whereas if I were to say to someone else that this is a good petrol car, I would be much less convincing, and quite rightly so, because I don't know as much as my dad does about petrol cars.
Excellent. I love the analogies. Cool. So if you've gone through this research for the fintech that you started with, done the Series A, when did you actually start forming the idea of ShipShape.vc, and when did you actually start that company essentially?
So I left the fintech company, and it was probably about 3 months after, I'd taken some sort of downtime. Like some of the hours that I'd been working were crazy and completely unsustainable. And I basically just needed some time out from that kind of life. And then I was just in my mind, probably on a long walk somewhere, just going through, okay, what had just happened? Like where the roller coaster that I'd just been on, where did I think that things had potentially been so imbalanced? And I think one of the things that I kept on coming back to was the amount of time that trying to find specialist investors in the niche that we're operating in had taken. That was for me like a really big like obstacle to be able to function both efficiently and sustainably. And so I thought, well, actually, if this is a problem for me, I wonder how many other people have probably run into that problem. How much time / how much more success would you potentially achieve if you were able to access a system that did a lot of that work for you? That's kind of where it came to me. And it was also in the middle of, at the start of COVID, and we'd seen loads of disruption to lots of businesses, and you'd also seen lots of evolution to that. So I was lucky enough to spend it at my in-laws in Wales, and a beautiful part of Wales in sort of the south coast, just outside Swansea. And there are loads of really interesting, this is the time where supermarkets were running out of bare essentials. There was essentially rationing going on at the supermarkets because the supply chains were shot. And you had local farmers, fishermen, etc., who were unable to get their product to the shelves in time. And therefore, you had these big problems. And there were also these really innovative responses to the problems that COVID were causing in terms of social distancing, like people who had set up businesses which would deliver pharmacy prescriptions to the vulnerable. These all these innovations were happening, but at the same time, you had lots of these companies, very innovative companies locally, but they weren't directly connected to capital. So the combination of that experience previously, but also seeing innovative companies that needed to raise capital to scale, really sort of gave me the sort of, not just this, here's a big problem, but actually here's one of the reasons why it matters to do this now. And so those two factors really are what prompted me to be like, actually, this is worth solving. I know how we can potentially solve this.
Amazing. Yeah, sounds great, and that makes a lot of sense. And you've got co-founders as well, haven't you? So where did you meet them, and how did they get involved in this idea?
Yeah, so co-founder Alistair, and actually we'd been working together at the previous company, the fintech company. So I think he left probably about 3 to 4 months after I did. And yeah, I knew that we got on because we'd been in the trenches together in the previous company. I knew that we shared values, and that ultimately he's got much more experience. He had worked in a couple of fintech companies previously, and before that in a bunch of banks too. I'm sure he won't mind me saying it, but he's slightly longer in the tooth than I am, and a sort of an old hand when it comes to knowing about the operations and sort of the guts and the wiring of a company, something that I'd never done before. Even though it had been in early stage companies previously, but I knew that actually someone like Alistair would be a really good person to work with. And yeah, like 6 and a bit years in now, and yeah, still love working with him. It's really good fun.
Excellent. And so yeah, beginning of that COVID time, then you're formulating all these ideas, putting it together, and then actually launching. When was your launch date, and what was that first 12 months like?
So it took about 2.5 years to both figure out, and I'm going to caveat this is in a pre-LLM world. Data science was just starting to become a bit more widely understood and utilized in certain industries. Some industries have been using it for essentially several decades. Some even longer if you're in the insurance world or actuarial world. Essentially, there are people who are doing data science. But yeah, from a compute perspective, still there weren't that many people who were coming out of that space. So yeah, it took sort of 2.5 years to decide what the build was going to be and build it. And then the first 12 months post-launch, yeah, really, really exciting. Still so many problems we'd created for ourselves that we also hadn't yet decided on the business model. We knew that we wanted the search engine to be free, but we're still experimenting with, okay, like, do we charge a small amount with the intention of in future going free? Do we charge corporates? Do we charge funds for access to the search engine? And yeah, honestly, it's really hard because if you're doing something that's genuinely a unique take on a market, there isn't necessarily a playbook for you to directly follow because you want to lean into your strengths, You want to zig whilst others are zagging. And that's ultimately what we ended up doing was we realized that the uniqueness of what we do is to offer something for free. And that ultimately there needs to be a business model that would support that. But, probably due to my economics background, we experimented with an auction model. So where corporates and partners of the search engine could essentially do something not dissimilar to Google, where you've got people who bid for advertising slots within Google. And we wanted to do something similar. Now, it turns out actually that's quite a complicated piece to do, where you've got a search engine that you need to build and maintain on one side, and then build an auction model on the other with a team of like less than 10 people is really difficult. There are reasons why people build specialist bits of technology for each bit. And so that was definitely some of my early naivety about how difficult it was to build things. But in both cases, I realized that we don't need to do this so much these days. But I still think it's a really good way of getting out the blocks. Both the search engine and the auction model, we basically built an Excel to start with. So we basically built a glorified Control F function in Excel to act as the first version of the search engine. And then likewise for the auction model, we basically had sheets that our customers would basically write in, not quite in pen and ink, but would write in on an Excel sheet what they were bidding for a certain prize parameter for companies. And so, these were, honestly, it was a lot of fun to do it because you also figure out a lot of the mechanics that help guide your company. And I know that you can do that. You can do more things in LLMs these days, but I think actually, for the sake of having a very clear view of how the mechanics of something functions, being able to write it all out in Excel to start with is something I just find invaluable still today. And lots of fun, lots of learning, and lots of mistakes.
How important was it to you to have a co-founder to bounce all this off from as well, even from a mental and emotional state setting up a company?
Yeah, I think we've nearly died a couple of dozen times where it's been potentially cash out at the end of the month and somehow find a way through. And having someone like Alistair there has been I joke with my actual wife that Alistair is my work wife, and that is definitely true. If you find the right person, they are your emotional support through a very difficult or potentially very difficult journey. And I definitely think that ours has been pretty difficult, easier than many companies, but it's not been an easy ride. So having someone like Alistair has been just essential. And I don't think we've got as far as we have. In fact, we definitely would not have got as far as we have without him. And having someone with a deep intellect to be able to bounce these ideas off and test things out with, like with anyone that you're working with in a company, if you find a good partnership with someone, you'll often come up with a far better solution than either of you would have done on your own. And that's one of my favorite things to do is to work through something new with Alistair. It's really good fun.
I love it. That's what a good partnership should be. So 1 and 1 equals 3, that sort of thing, or 10.
Well, and actually, it definitely, this is a common problem, I think. You'll have seen it on numerous occasions. So many founders end up sort of looking for a co-founder and go on co-founder dating. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work out, because even if you find someone and you like the look of them and the sound of them from sort of co-founder dating, as it were, you actually don't know the person. You've not been in the trenches with them. You've not been through some kind of tough life situation with them. And I would definitely recommend to others that if they've got a close friend that they've been through some tough scenarios with together, actually that's a really good place to start, because you'll naturally probably differentiate in terms of the role that you take within the company and the learning that you're willing to do it. So I think more people should actually look at their network and their friendship group for co-founders rather than necessarily just looking external. Yes, you might want some technical expertise. Hopefully that exists in your network, but I'd definitely go with someone that you've worked with before and where you've got the measure of them.
Yeah, I saw a great infographic the other day. I have to try and dig it out, but it was with all the top companies around the world, sort of a handful of top 50, where they met their co-founders. And there's a surprising amount, like you're saying, that were friends or classmates, basically saying that your co-founder, your future co-founder, is probably already in your network and you already know them. You just haven't hit that point yet.
I think that's such a great piece of advice, and people should, I think, look more closely at their own network and not be afraid to have that conversation of, do you want to do something crazy together?
I love it. Cool. So with ShipShape VC then, when did you start eating your own dog food? When did you look at raising?
So we're going through, it was an angel round, and we basically identified which investors were interested in the role that data science could play in venture capital, and reached out and had a really good conversation with, he was director of data science over at Balderton. This is a big UK VC fund. He was the director of data science over there at the time. And we ended up having a great conversation about the role that data science could play in the market. And the evolution of data science in the market has come so far and has become so popularized that there are now memes. I saw on this morning of like a VC in 2016 thinking about sourcing whilst working on a laptop, and then a picture of it today where they've got all these like tools that they leverage to try and get some better deal flow, better deal analysis, like competition analysis, et cetera. They've got these tools now that really assist them. But this was back in what, like, I don't know, 2022, 2023, when we're having these conversations. I think we actually had used a prototype version of our system to identify Francesco as being someone that we want to have a chat with. And we knew that he worked at Balderton, thought there was a chance that he might be an angel investor as well. But he actually became a customer of our system first. And I think probably about like 9 months to a year in after him being a customer, we're doing a round, and we asked him if he wanted to participate, and yeah, he did. But that all happened because we'd identified that he was someone relevant to us and really knew the domain that we're in via our own search engine. Perhaps our paths would have crossed otherwise, but it might have been later, and it might well have not come to pass that he invested.
Yeah, amazing. And so you went through that whole process yourself as well in terms of, was that a seed round or was it?
Yeah, so we've actually done a series of angel rounds. Yeah. So I guess probably pre-seed is what you'd categorize it as. But again, I think the earlier that you can tap someone into your like company and to be on your cap table with domain knowledge, the more helpful it's going to be, because they see the evolution of yourselves as a company. And actually, even today, where he's changed roles, he now advises a number of like VC funds. That leads to you've got far more optionality and far greater ability to navigate the earlier that you can bring someone onto your cap table. It's not always a fit, because some funds will have stage gating in terms of like where you need to be at before they'll invest. But if you can have knowledgeable angels, they'll often work really hard to help you succeed. And it's like having another team.
Yeah. Sounds great. It goes back to that point that you were making earlier about finding people that understand your niche and understand your business.
I definitely wouldn't ask me to be repairing a petrol car, but I would ask my dad.
Excellent. So obviously, yes, now 6.5 years in, you've helped raise 2.1 billion, for companies all around. Is this now fully global, or helping companies, or companies are using the engine all around the world?
Yes. Yeah. So we have everywhere from like Uzbekistan through to some of the Pacific islands. We've seen companies use this. We've not done any marketing or promotion in those locations. So these are companies that have found out about it organically. So we've helped just over 7,500 companies with their investor research. And yeah, we've seen that the amount raised by those companies is, and actually we've got founders who reach out to us as well to say like, this is super helpful. It's been transformational for the funds that are getting involved in their round. Like, yeah, to be able to make that difference, but also across a wider geography than we ever anticipated, the search engine being. It's a testament to the team that's built it.
Pacific Islanders raising a bit of funding. I love that.
Well, talent is global, capital is not. So, yeah.
Indeed. I know you talk a lot as well about, like you mentioned earlier, investment in companies that are outside of like main city hubs like London, value that in London versus outside, and how much more difficult that is in terms of raising funds. Have you found a lot of companies that have been based outside of like London, like the UK, for example? A lot of companies outside have been using ShipShape and found it value or extra value because they're not in the vicinity of London?
Yes. So I think there are a couple of points to sort of dive into more deeply here. London is by far and away the biggest ecosystem within the UK. But what we've seen from our data is there's a knowledge that this is a more buoyant market for founders who are building in London. And we see that in terms of how founders are valuing their company. because they're in London, there are lots of investors, there are lots of other companies there too. Information about like essentially company pricing can exchange really quickly. And so, you know, we'll see a founder raising, if they're raising like a $500,000 seed or pre-seed round, like we'll see what their like anticipated dilution is going to be for that round. Whereas if you go out somewhere like here where we're having this call for, I'm having this call from in Wales, you'll actually see that dilution percentage jump from 13% to 21%. And that is a huge change in like the amount of the company that someone's having to sell to raise that capital. And a big part of that is basically because you don't have as many investors known locally. So you're in a buyer's market in terms of the equity. It's a buyer's market, not necessarily a seller's market. And that I think is something that's really interesting, but actually I think means that companies outside of big financial centers or centers of investment actually have more to gain from using a tool like ours, because it means that they can make a bigger market, generate more competition relative to what their domestic market looks like. And I know that obviously lots of founders will have to raise domestically for many of their rounds, but many more are now looking overseas for more domain relevant investors, setting up things like a Delaware C Corp, you know, to entice or enable US investors to invest in a round. I think that's something that we'll see more of. I think founders are becoming much smarter about how they maximize the size of the market and the number of buyers for the equity that they're selling. So I think that's actually a really exciting and positive development for what's happening in this market. More choice for founders and companies who are selling equity, and also more choice for investors in terms of the number of companies and specific companies that they want exposure to.
So as a founder, I mean, going back to that US sort of analogy you mentioned there, do you find that's a sort of common move for UK or European companies looking at setting something up and finding investors in the States as well as Europe?
Yes. So that is something that many companies that use the search engine tell us that they want to expand it internationally. Now, in part, that's for customers, but in part that's also for investors. And if you can find a market that's got both, and the US is unique in being one of the biggest consumer markets in the world, if not the biggest, and one of the largest corporate markets in the world, if not the biggest, and it's undisputedly the biggest VC market in the world. It's no surprise that it's close to 9 in 10 companies that want to expand internationally will list the United States as being a market that they want to move to or expand to, which is, by far and away the biggest single country or market that founders name. So it's, no surprise that more and more founders are trying to find different ways about accessing and tapping into that market. And we've got US customers, we've got a couple of US investors, and it's definitely, if I were to do this time again, I think I would set up the company in a very different way to the way that we have, just to be able to sort of go US first from day one.
Yeah. So in terms of all the investors and VCs, et cetera, you've got on the platform, have you had to go out and sort of collate those, build the relationships and then bring them on board? Or is it more from a research perspective?
I think this is one of the areas where we knew from day one that was like going out and trying to survey investors and get them to participate in yet another platform to give their data regularly was just a non-starter. The feedback that we'd received about different approaches, and also I think we fundamentally had intuited that was not a sustainable model, and that actually our salvation lay in pursuing a data science approach and essentially being in listening mode for what's happening on the internet. That's actually what drove us to take the approach that we have, which is we'll monitor what's happening in terms of publicly announced transactions to look at funds and identify which funds out there have participated in transactions. That then leads to a whole sort of string of like sequences to go and obtain more pertinent information about the sort of like almost heat/relationship map that company is in. And so that's kind of the approach that we've taken, so that we didn't need to go and try and speak with tens of thousands of VCs and funds to get them to regularly update their information, because we just we designed the system around an assumption that they wouldn't want to talk to us. Which starting out is definitely the case.
Yeah, I can imagine. I know you mentioned obviously this was pre-LLM that you started everything. Obviously with AI coming into full force and accelerating, especially the last year or even months. How has that affected the way that you guys are doing things and building for the future?
So there are definitely areas where, so LLMs are incredibly powerful for many tasks, but when you give an LLM a relatively large data set to run over and do it multiple times, like the cost of that can be quite high and prohibitive from a compute perspective. So there are more lightweight models that are specialized for certain tasks that are far more efficient from a compute price perspective. So we'll use LLMs for some things. So they're pretty good at creating summaries that are not what we call lossy. So they don't lose key facts and they retain the original meaning. They're quite good at that. And we do use them for that. But in terms of actually the large scale, large volume processing, we don't think that that works as well because they're ultimately more generalist tools. And yes, you can fine tune, you can tune it for certain tasks. But actually, if you've got a more lightweight system that can work, actually that's often better. Stringing together a sequence of essentially, what many in today's parlance we could call agents. Like if you've got a system of essentially agents that are lightweight that you've coded, you're not going to burn through anywhere near the number of tokens because you're ultimately using compute that you own to do it rather than using an LLM to do it where the compute potentially on the other end is really expensive because many of these companies have needed to buy additional compute, sometimes at a premium, in order to be able to service the market that they're serving. So that's kind of what I think about it.
Yeah, great. No, it's interesting to hear. Obviously, in the sort of company that you're in as well, from a data perspective. What does the next five or so years look like for ShipShape VC then? Where are you guys looking to go and grow?
So we're looking at the private market in general, so i.e. companies that are not publicly listed. We're looking within that space because ultimately we think that companies and holders of equity want to transact, and it's a market in which that is quite difficult to do and is one in which there are lots of intermediaries that people have to go through to try and execute a transaction. Because there are lots of intermediaries and there's a lot of dispersion of effort in that market, that it doesn't operate that efficiently and effectively. And so we think that there's a more efficient way of bringing together both buyers and sellers of equity in private markets. So that's what we're looking at doing, but we'll have to see what the future holds. But that's something we're really excited about because there are so many people, both in terms of founders and holders of equity, who potentially want to transact at different points in time. And again, they'll have the same problem in terms of who potentially wants to buy this piece of equity that I'm holding. So we think it's a very logical way of extending kind of the system that we've built to beyond. So just identifying investors from I want to raise capital for my company to power it to do X. It might just be, I want to change this piece of paper with you in exchange for some of your pieces of paper.
Like a value exchange system. I see there's been a couple of announcements recently about, I think, Robinhood and another fund as well, raising to help people get into VC opportunities or private opportunities as well from a retail point of view.
Yeah, I think this is something we're going to see more of. I think there are more of if you look at what's happening with the S&P and which companies are driving the growth and the charge of the S&P's increase in value, people are realizing that actually, whilst there are some brilliant companies that are more conventional in shape and what they do, huge amounts of value are being driven from new technologies and new technology companies. And so I think there's going to be a continued drive from retail investors to get better access and exposure to private markets, and in particular, the innovation companies within those private markets, because of their capacity to solve big problems and solve the bottlenecks that we're facing the world over today. I think this is where retail investors are going to basically be demanding more exposure to that. And it doesn't surprise me that organizations like Robinhood are enabling more and more investors and more retail investors to get better exposure to that market. And it's great for funds as well, because they're not going to be just chasing elusive LPs to to go and raise a fund, they potentially can do more of a fund from retail. I'm not saying all of a fund necessarily, but I think they could do more from retail. I think retail investors will again have to take, if we take the generalist versus specialist analogy, retail investors treat them like generalist investors. They're going to have to take comfort from some kind of specialist about why they've chosen to back a fund.
Yeah, makes sense. Danny, before we sort of wrap up here as well, I'd love to just go through a few quick fire questions and
go for it.
And get your thoughts. One of them was, obviously you speak with a lot of different companies, and you've got a lot of different companies using your platform. Where do you see as the biggest opportunities at the moment that people aren't taking seriously?
I think there are, because of what AI and LLMs can do, I think that actually there's a lot of value in potentially like investing in very early stage companies where the future requirement from those companies in terms of future capital investment is going to be smaller, because ultimately more of the tech build, maintenance, and future development can be done by a pretty small team. So you can be extremely capital efficient for certain types of companies. And I think there are niches in which people are going to be building valuable things that may not be unicorn scale opportunities, but nor does someone need to raise capital to really shoot for the stars in every single instance. So I think that there are more opportunities that are likely to succeed in certain niches today because AI makes it easier to succeed. You might not capture all of the market because fundamentally you've got either more competition or companies that started ahead of you that are doing something similar but not quite the same thing. I think that there are more opportunities for investors to go smaller check sizes into potentially more companies. Those companies may not do the traditional VC model of essentially, you need one of them to do essentially 1,000x your initial or 100x your initial investment value, and the rest can fail. I think we're likely to see more companies succeed, but at a smaller scale. And I think that fundamentally changes the investment market and the way that investment can work. I'm not saying that there won't be a place for the moonshots and VC, and obviously we're seeing more and more companies be wildly successful in terms of leveraging technology and generating market value from that for them, their investors, and most importantly, their customers. But I think there are lots more companies that are going to be in some way successful too. And I think that opens up new opportunities for investors to invest in companies that are going to be successful, but they might not sort of shoot for the stars.
Yeah, really interesting. Another one, I know you mentioned earlier, if you were starting again today, did you do things slightly differently? If you were starting again today and you didn't have the sort of the money, the network, etc., and you were looking to set up as a founder, where would you start today, and how would you set yourself up for success?
So I think the two biggest VC markets in the world are the United States and the UK. And I think now, having had exposure to the US, I would go to the US and start there. I think customers say yes faster, and so do investors. And I think that's something that the UK could do with taking a leaf from the US book, because I think the reason for US corporate success is that risk-taking attitude that many US corporates have, and indeed actually you find more even in government in the US. They're willing to push the boat out, whereas I think we're fundamentally more conservative in the UK, and both in terms of the sort of corporate and government decision making, but also in terms of the investment market. I think there's more of a sort of how do I protect myself against downside risk rather than how big could this be, which is fundamentally like what many US investors ask themselves. And so yeah, I would today, given that I know much more about the way the market is and where there would be corporate and commercial opportunities in the US, I'd start in the US. But I think that it is important to know more about the market before you sort of just decide to serve a dead OSC. I'm not saying that can't work, but I think it's a bit harder if you don't have that market knowledge.
Yeah, no, interesting. Yeah, completely different mindset and mind shift, isn't it?
I hope,
and then,
for what it's worth, I do hope that other jurisdictions become more competitive, because I think that creates overall this is not a zero-sum game. If you create a more competitive environment, you'll get both more companies from overseas, but also more companies domestically being created. So don't think this is zero sum. I hope that something happens with like, I know that there's the EU Inc. Sort of drive to try and create a genuine single market within Europe. I think that's really hard to do, but I hope even that drive to create a more competitive environment is fundamentally a net win for all concerned around the world.
Yeah, interesting insights on that. And then lastly as well, what piece of advice have you had as a founder from mentors or co-founders, etc., that you think would be like invaluable for a future founder that you could pass on?
I think being curious, like, or allowing your curiosity to let your curious self out more in terms of when you're meeting with a customer, potentially an investor. Like, I think showing that curiosity is really helpful and helps. It enables you to sort of look around, see around corners, and spot things that others might not. And there are definitely several years at the start where we thought that we knew. Well, it's not that we didn't listen to customers or users, but we were not as curious as we could have been in conversations that we had the opportunity to have. And it's not that we didn't ask questions. I just think that today I'd ask more probing, deeper questions about what someone's problem set is or what someone's challenge is before we go away and build something. Because you can often, I think you can skip ladders of development by doing that.
Mm. Yeah, you'll really fall in love with the problem.
Yeah. What was that? Yeah, and like, are you obsessed with the product you're building, or are you obsessed with solving someone's problem? I think that those two are distinct, and just because someone else has always done something, or just because an industry has always done something in one way, like actually, this is probably a pretty good example. So essentially, all of our competitors have like a client login portal where the paying customers log into something. We don't have that. Like there's nothing for anyone to log into, which is unique in approach in the industry, and was fundamentally because we were a bit more curious than we were initially going to build a portal, which would have at the time essentially cost $700,000 essentially to build, because there were all sorts of complexities and like how you now manage different data sets and data pools. But by avoiding that, because we listened to the customer, by this point we're starting to ask more probing questions. I think by doing that, we basically dodged the need for building like an entire new estate to be built, managed, maintained, further developed. And that's been the biggest takeaway actually, is that curiosity and asking better questions of customers and users.
Great, I love it. Great insights. And then finally, as well, before we start to wrap up, where did the name ShipShape come from?
So I really like my nautical history, and honestly, I didn't know what we were going to do as a company. So I knew what we were going to do as a company to start with, but it didn't feel that important about what we named the company. So a big fan of the Aubrey Maturin series, which, if you've ever seen Master and Commander, is the series of books that film is based on. And there are so many expressions that come from old naval slang, like showing someone the ropes, for example, comes from there. And there are
till the bitter end.
Till the bitter end, exactly. Yeah. So there are a number of others, but ShipShape comes from the saying "shipshape in Bristol fashion," which is for when something is in good order. And so we thought actually, ShipShape .vc would be for helping you get your round and the investors in your round in good order.
Fantastic. And then I was going to say, how should someone get in touch if they want to find out a bit more about ShipShape? But it is shipshape.vc.
Yeah, go to the website, or indeed, very happy. Folks can reach out on LinkedIn, and I'm usually pretty responsive. So yeah, very happy to field anything there.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast and talking through ShipShape, your journey, and what it is you guys are doing. It's awesome, and looking forward to seeing where you guys go.
Thanks so much, Anthony. Thanks for having me, and it's been really fun.
Brilliant. And thank you everyone for listening. We'll see you next time.